Thank you for returning. I'm glad I didn't bore you so much yesterday that you've actually returned today. That's always encouraging. Today I'm going to talk some familiar stuff, I'm sure, about the early development of the black middle class, and then I'm going to compress that with the black middle class under the ANC, just the basic dynamics whereby the black middle class has expanded and grown and to some extent prospered since then. We all, I think, I'm sure you're all fairly familiar with our fairly brutal history in this country, and well, this gentleman has quite a lot to answer for in terms of the limited prospects for the black middle class in the post-war period, post-1945 period. Let us just go back just to recap some of the stuff which I'm sure you're pretty familiar with. The basic fact about the black middle class, which we always need to bear in mind, was that before 1994 it was subject to massive disadvantages. It was deliberately held back by all sorts of policy. Clearly, we have to look at the 19th century history of conquest, which placed the black people in this country in a position of racial subordination. We have to look at the enormous land loss that was involved, which was responsible to a very significant degree for the extinction of a fairly prosperous peasantry in various parts of the country. Colin Bundy was the prime historian of the growth of a peasantry, particularly in the Eastern Cape in the 19th century, and traces in a very famous book in the early 70s how it was gradually eroded through a series of various legislations and pressures, land loss and so on and so forth. And I think the basic thing, of course, about the black middle class was that it was faced, as with other black people, this whole issue of legislated inequality. Nonetheless, the black middle class did manage to develop. Out of originally, the missions played the most significant role in terms of providing space in educational space for the development of a very small number of people. Literacy, of course, was needed to read the Bible. Literacy was needed to enable a number of people to gain jobs in the colonial administration as low-level clerks and interpreters in courts and so forth. And the missions were based on separate pieces of land. Many of the early missions were sort of quite separate communities, so that the early black Christians were very often cut off from other non-Christian communities, and they were made to feel sort of rather special in some ways. The small middle class, or emergent petty bourgeoisie, as it's often referred to in the literature, was largely composed of people entering some fairly classic professions. Of course, the early black church ministers, or lay preachers, or sometime church officials, teachers preeminently, although in this early period, preeminently in primary schools, which did not go much above the very early grades, clerks and interpreters, some better off farmers and so forth. I think the key characteristic which we need to recall is that this middle class was exceptionally small, and it was asset poor. In other words, it didn't have any capital behind it. Although you do find, I think that what you do find is that the better off farmers tended to begin to put their money behind their children in terms of acquiring education and so on and so forth. I think above all, why isn't that moving? What's going on here? Sorry. Above all, the small petty bourgeoisie was respectable. And I'm sure you're all familiar with some of the wonderful old photographs you get of these early middle-class families as Pixley is portrayed here, top hat and so on and so forth. Then there's another nice picture I picked up, simply of the leaders of the ICU, the International Commercial Union, of the early trade union which picked up in the 1920s and spread like wildfire throughout South Africa. Even though claiming to be a working class organisation, these people look extremely respectable and well-mannered and so on and so forth. It was small, but within black society, which was cut off from social contact with white society, the emergent black bourgeoisie was very much an elite. It had status within the black community. Its respectability contributed to that. It was well looked up to in the black community. But of course, its upward mobility into society at large was severely limited, was deliberately constrained. It was not able to mix on equal class terms with white middle class people of the time. And above all, of course, it lacked any sort of political influence and power, which led very quickly to its becoming a key component, a key contributor to the formation of the ANC from 1912 onwards. The formation of the ANC owed an awful lot to the early black middle class. When those people gathered together in Bloemfontein, many of them were wearing their top hats and carrying their umbrellas and so forth. And they mixed with the traditional leaders of the time and a few less well-off people, working class people. They were really, if you like, that early literate generation of African middle-class people were perhaps the most influential element behind the formation of the ANC. But I think what we see at this time was the notion of the ANC as a representative of the people, that it was always from the beginning a cross-class alliance, with the black middle class being so small, having to join up with other blacks within black society of different backgrounds, because the basic point about the ANC was, of course, trying to get the reversal of the Land Act and trying to get some sort of political influence, and going off to London to try to lobby the colonial power and so on and so forth. Just check this. Yes. So I'm rather skipping through the history because I want to get to the ANC, but by the early 1950s, the black middle class, which during the 30s and 40s had been respectable, and in being respectable had still been considerably conservative. It had very liberal demands asking for increased political influence one way or the other. It wrote respectable letters to government ministers. It lobbied various government ministers and London for improvement in black conditions and so forth. But we all know that by the late 1940s, the ANC was facing, so the ANC leadership of the time was facing a challenge from the then Youth League. And by the time we get to the early 1950s, the ANC was to become radicalized by the influence of the Youth League and the strikes in the post-war period. And gradually the ANC became the leader not just of the leadership grouping, but it also became the leader of a mass movement during the 1950s. I think the Congress movement of the 1950s, in other words, the Congress alliance between the ANC and the coloured and the Indian groups and the Congress of Democrats and so forth, was considerably less elitist. But I think it's worth stressing that even throughout the 30s and 40s, although the ANC had always had a predominantly middle-class membership, it is stressed by some historians, notably by one called Peter Lim, who about 2 years ago published an extensive new history of the ANC during this period, arguing that the middle-class individuals of that time were not so cut off from their local communities as perhaps they were in the early years. That they had relatives who were always poor. Being so small, they lived in black communities in which daily contact with working class people and African peasants and so forth was inevitable and part of their lives. They may well have been servicing them as lawyers and doctors and so forth. So they were never completely cut off. So that provided the basis for the Congress movement to become not just a mass movement, but also a cross-class alliance. And it was, of course, but in becoming mass and with the increased influence of the trade unions and so forth, and of the South African Communist Party during the 50s, the extent to which the black middle class actually dominated the ANC during the 1950s is still a matter of quite a lot of debate and conversation. However, what we do know, of course, is that quite a number of black middle-class individuals in the party joined to the armed struggle. And they were going to suffer in the resultant suppression of the liberation movements, and many, of course, went into exile and played their part in the liberation struggle from outside. And that, of course, is a different part of the history. Inside the country, of course, during the 1960s, the black middle class, as the black working class too, went into something of a period of quiescence, of acquiescence. They were overpowered by the military power of the state. And it was not until the early 1970s that there was again a return to, if you like, very overt struggle by the black population in terms of the strikes of 1973, the Durban strikes, and then, of course, Soweto, which set the whole ball rolling again. Now, I want to just look at really what I think what's quite important is for us to understand is to try to get at some of those changes that were taking place in this period after 1960. What was happening during this period, which is so often dismissed as a period of black quiescence? What sort of change was going on in black society? And I think that the situation was that there was slow change, which retrospectively we see was significant in building the development of a black middle class. Bantu education, as we all know from 1953, was deliberately established under Verwoerd to keep the black man and woman in their place, to keep them in a position of servitude. They were not going to be required in the higher echelons of society, and they were to receive, as a result, a very inferior education. But of course, despite that, there was to be a significant increase in black schooling, one way or the other, as increasingly the economy demanded more people at fairly low level positions, but they also, during this period, of course, as the economy expanded, the 60s were the fastest period growth in the economy which had yet been experienced. There was quite a high level of industrialization, and of course there was a steady movement of whites up through the occupational structure, leaving gaps behind them for which there was needed replacements. And if we look at what happened over this long period in terms of black schooling, 1945 we've got nearly 600,000 people of blacks in schools. 1970 we were at 2.7 million. Look at that then. Next 18 years, we have a very massive expansion of blacks moving into schools. That's quite an impressive expansion. Of course, as I'll be talking about tomorrow, education is actually absolutely quite crucial to thinking of to understanding the development of the middle class. And then, of course, during this period too, there was increasing need for some form of higher skilled and better educated black workforce, and we get, alongside the beginning of the Homeland program, the opening of the black universities. I think the Transkei was first, but it was soon to be followed by the Bophuthatswanas, the Vendors, and heaven knows what. And of course, this was also linked to limited entry to black students into the historically white universities for specific courses such as medicine and law and so forth. So this provided the opportunity for people like Nelson Mandela to go to Wits and so on and so forth. We also have the entry of blacks into the technikons, and that should not be forgotten. I don't have the figures with me. I think at this period, if we're looking at a black middle class, we are still seeing it concentrated in the classic professions in which blacks had been channeled in terms of upward social mobility. Teaching and nursing above all. Both, of course, this was heavily gendered in terms of, on the whole, that teaching still tended to be dominated by males, and nursing was overwhelmingly female, of course. And there was still entry into the classic professions of church law and medicine. But I think the other interesting thing which was happening, particularly from the 1970s onwards, was the slow penetration of blacks into the corporate sector at the lowest levels of management. Let us remember that during this period, the corporations were subject to a number of pressures. First of all, of course, there was the whole issue of the need for person power. I've talked about the upward movement of whites leaving behind spaces below which enabled Africans to move into the lower levels of supervisory jobs and low levels of management and so forth. But there were also, if you remember, those things called the codes of conduct coming from external pressure, which in many ways set up the template for BE codes later on in a later era. and the various codes of conduct coming from the EU, from the Brits, from the American Sullivan Code and so forth. The Canadians also had a code. They were set out a list of requirements which were supposedly laid down for the various foreign firms to follow, so as basically to take the pressure off them to disinvest completely. So in exchange for the governments of those countries saying stay in South Africa, supposedly they were to boost black skills development and employment and so forth. There was also the factor that during this period there was a very high rate of African urbanization, of course, and it began to click in white corporate circles that there was a need for black personnel in management to chase after a small but increasingly significant black market. And so what you find during this period, particularly in the personnel level, you'll find black entry into personnel. As some black people expressed it at the time, you needed blacks to handle the natives. And then, of course, there was the growth of the black middle class in the homelands. It was a very deliberate strategy in terms of the development of the Bantustans, in terms of the development of people holding political office. There was the various homeland regimes, which in many ways were made up of black middle class people themselves. What did they want and what did they see? They saw the need for more education, so they developed they sought to expand their own educational systems, and that demanded more teachers. They developed their own nursing professions and so forth. They developed their own civil services. So you get a very significant expansion of a segment of the black middle class inside the homelands. Later, during the 1980s, when black urban protest was putting a lot of pressure upon the regime also saw it necessary to increasingly try to develop a collaborative black middle class in the urban areas. If white administrators couldn't any longer control the townships, perhaps urban black councillors could. So there was an expansion of black urban councils and and so on. Was this, so often the terminology was used in terms of both these sorts of involvement in, if you like, regime structures. At the time, much of the literature referred to a collaborative petty bourgeoisie and so forth. Looking back, I think we have to be perhaps more open-minded and say, of course, much of the involvement of black middle-class people in these various apartheid structures was basically pragmatic. How many of them bought the ideology in the homelands? I suspect rather few. Probably the politicians who were more directly involved in it in terms of belonging to the Transkei National Independence Party or whatever. The civil servants, who knows? But basically what people were wanting, if you're stuck in Umtata, you basically want to have a job, and if the best jobs are in the local civil service and it's a Bantustan civil service, what do? You join up. Does this mean that you're pro-apartheid? I rather suspect it doesn't. But it may put you in something of a difficult situation. But anyway, this is one of those things which I think we need to understand, the extent to which perhaps involvement in these structures is actually pragmatic and career-oriented, basically. In the urban areas, there was a steady lifting of restrictions of new housing. There was improvements in housing provided by the regime, improvements in education and employment opportunities. There was also greater opportunity for the expansion of a small African capitalist class. And again, this went across not only urban areas, but into the homelands as well. We get this in the homelands through the opening up of the various development corporations, which were designed to promote a small African trading class. You will find, for instance, in the Transkei, you will find that the Transkei traders were bought out by the Homeland Development Corporations, and black entrepreneurs were given loans to buy the various garages and the bottle stores and so forth, and this was meant to provide the basis for the development of black capitalism. In the urban areas, it was also a black capitalist stratum was also fostered. But let us go back to some more statistics. Owen Crankshaw, who teaches in the sociology department at UCT, did a very important study of the period of the 1980s, 1970s, 80s, in terms of what he terms the changing racial division of labour during this late apartheid period. And what we see is just some statistics here. By 1990, 41% of what we term the semi-professions, in other words, the teachers and the nurses, most particularly, the pharmacists and so forth, something like just over 40% of those semi-professions was made up of African people, African middle-class people. There was a similar advance into white-collar jobs in the economy, over 30% by 1990. And this followed the floating colour bar. In other words, what I've talked about, the vacation of employment opportunities by the movement of whites into high-level positions. So what we are seeing here is, if you like, a preparation of the ground for an expansion of the black middle class after 1990. This was largely based upon changes in the economy, the changing labour needs of the economy, and to some extent the political aspirations of the then regime. And it was during this period that, of course, that as the black middle class increased in size and in confidence, and to some extent in strategic location in the economy in terms of its movement into the management, that it began to reassert its political role in organisations like the United Democratic Front, and I think in reasserting the black middle class into a leadership position in the class alliance with the ANC at its head. Now, this is really where I'm going to sort of change gear, because now we are moving to what's happened against this background, what has happened after 1994. And I'm looking here at the promotion of the black middle class under the ANC. It's often what's happened after 1994 has often been depicted, not just by radical scholars, as an elite transition, basically, of the white and black elites coming together and saying, what we don't want is to destroy the country through a civil war. Neither of us can defeat the other, so let's do some form of a deal. Now, if we are to accept that sort of idea, then I think the other question that comes forward is, has the black middle class been the major beneficiary of what has happened since 1994? I think there are strong reasons for arguing that that is the case. Although, of course, I think there have been very significant changes on the ground floor in terms of the provision of a very impressive number of houses, however modest those may be, even if I think one could criticize them for perhaps building the slums of the future, but nonetheless there have been significant achievements in housing, and of course in terms of social security. So I'm not suggesting that the only people who have benefited from what's happened since 1994 has been the black middle class, but I would suggest that these are the people who've done considerably better than anybody else. And how's this happened? I think by three mechanisms: political deployment and the rise of what I term an ANC party state, equity employment, and black economic empowerment. And I'm suggesting that via these mechanisms, the ANC is in many ways following the historical example of the Afrikaner National Party during the 1930s, and particularly after 1948. Let us look a little bit at political deployment. I know this is a very controversial aspect of the ANC's rule, but I don't think it's very difficult. I think it's very difficult to deny that it has happened. Let us first of all just think what we mean by political deployment. All political parties deploy individuals into various positions, advisory positions at the top of civil services and so on and so forth. But I think what differentiates a country like South Africa under the ANC, and probably under the National Party, from, say, an established democracy, supposedly like Britain, is the way in which a supposedly independent civil service has been, one would say, invaded by political appointments. And I think this has occurred in terms of the ANC appointing those who are not just black people, but black people who are known to be politically loyal to the ANC into significant positions at all three levels of government. Now, how do we know this is happening? First of all, we see it obviously happening to some extent in terms of known people, known party loyalists, known people. But it's also been traced quite significantly in a fair number of studies of how the ANC operates at provincial and local levels, in terms of, particularly in impoverished communities, how membership of the ANC is seen as absolutely vital to gaining some form of appointment in the public bodies, in local councils and in provincial administrations. In other words, political connections matter. And I think what you would find, I'm not suggesting that every public servant in this country is a card-carrying member of the ANC. That is not what I'm suggesting, nor am I suggesting that every public servant is unqualified and simply has ANC credentials. But nonetheless, I think that there has been a significant, that political deployment has been a very important and influential factor in getting appointments for many people within the public service and in other bodies. Why has this happened? Well, obviously, the ANC has been responding to its constituency in a slow growth economy. Let us see where the ANC came in 1994. For heaven's sake, the ANC was saying, we represent the broad mass of people in this country. We really have to do something for black people. We have to raise their status. We have to recognize that they voted us into power, and they voted us into power because they wanted to be recognized as people, they wanted to be recognized as citizens, and they wanted to see some significant material improvement in their lives. And every political party worth its salt is going to respond to its constituency. And its aims were to be transformation, that word which we have come to be so familiar with these days, and the way in which transformation, certainly in these spheres, was interpreted in terms of so-called demographic representativity. In other words, trying to align the national population statistics, 8% of whites, etc., in the country, into 8% of whites in public service and so forth. Those were that was the broad aim. And I think we also see in terms of the dynamics of the way this has worked out, is public employment has been seen as a route to private accumulation. And we'll come back to that later on when we look at BEE. But I think what we also see is the way in which political deployment has become interpenetrated with the factional struggles within the ANC in terms of who gets what, when and how, and so forth. Equity employment. The Equity Employment Act of 1998, along with various a bundle of legislation relating to skills development and so forth, sought to make the workforce more broadly representative. Basically, what the Equity Employment Act does is it requires employers to draw up plans for affirmative action related to those who have been historically disadvantaged, notably blacks, women, the disabled and so forth, and these include goals and time frames for equitable representation. And over the years, the targets which have been set, largely it's for firms with more than 50 employees, the targets have been successively ratcheted up. Now, how has this worked out in practice? I think the pace of transformation has varied, with black advance most rapid in the public service, followed by the state economic organisation, so I've got that the wrong way around, the SEOs, with the private sector lagging behind. Again, I apologise if it's too small, but transformation has taken place at a fairly similar pace across the three levels of government. Now, I'm not providing too many statistics here, but if we are looking at this, if I can point out, if we're looking at the workforce profile of the national government, which I cite as example, and this is divided up into black males, black females. We've got top management is 40% black male, black female it's 25%. We've got coloured males at 5%, coloured females at 3%, Indians at 6%, etc., whites down in top management in the public service to just under 12%, white males and white females, black down to just under 4%. Senior management, we're seeing similar figures. 39% now of senior management is black African. Nearly 25% is black female. I don't have to go through all this whole thing. You get the broad picture. So there has been, I think, a very significant shift in terms of the representation of blacks in the, as I say, three levels of government. I can produce similar tables at the other levels of government, and you'll find the figures are very, very similar. Its transformation has advanced less in terms of the state economic organisations. Here we find the top management in the, here is black African is just 33% and black female is 16%, and so 27% and 18%. Why slower in the state organisations like Denel and Eskom and so forth? I would suggest because there are fewer manual jobs. So we, when I was talking about the national figures, we are of course including So if we go back to the national table, we're looking down here at the lower levels of employment. But in the state organisations like ESCOM and so forth, quite probably require more technical skills and scientific knowledge. Other state organisations similar to those. In the private sector, we do find that the workforce profile is considerably slower. We find, so again, this is I think about 1990 as well. No, sorry, I think this is more or less, it's maybe about 2 years ago, based on returns in terms of the Equity Employment Act. Here we have black African males and black African females at just under 9% and just under 4% respectively. We find senior management 10% and 5%. Now, this is a considerably lower pace of upward movement in the private sector than in the public service. And of course, the private sector comes under a lot of tongue lashing from government because of this. Now, why, this is a controversial area, but why is it that the private sector has lagged behind? Is it positive resistance, positive white resistance, as is often argued by certain figures within the black community? Is it a shortage of qualified blacks, as very often argued by the white private sector themselves? They say we simply cannot find the black qualified people that we need. Is it because there is competition from the public service for the same limited pool of qualified black people? And is the public service seen as is it at core a more comfortable employment place for blacks? Because I think there's a lot of indications from interviews with black managers in the private sector that they feel as if they're not given a fair crack of the whip, that they feel there is some sort of invisible ceiling to their backward advance, and they cite many instances of discrimination against them, which may be conscious or it may be unconscious. But very definitely there is a feeling within both the black corporate sector and within the professions that it is difficult for blacks to make upward movement in those sectors. So which of those reasons is it? Well, probably it's a little bit of everything, but it does mean that there is, if you like, a problem there. BEE, Black Economic Empowerment, where's this coming from? Well, I would suggest that the motive force behind BEE broadly comes from two streams. First of all, in the early 1990s, large-scale capital, large-scale firms in this country were very eager to get on side with the ANC when it came into power. There had been a significant disjuncture between large-scale corporations and the National Party during the late years of apartheid. Large corporates recognised that they were under severe pressure. They themselves, I think, increasingly recognised that there was need for political incorporation of all blacks within the community. And so there was all sorts of connections with the ANC, as while the National Party was meeting with the ANC in Switzerland or something, the large corporates would be sponsoring boss parades, etc., in the bush or in Zambia or whatever. And they were seeking they were talking to the ANC and saying, look, we can work with you. And on the other hand, the ANC was determined to transform what was still a very racialized economy. And so they looked to some sort of a deal, to some sort of cooperation with the large corporates to ensure that there would be space for upward black movement into the corporate sector. And so there was a deal. Basically, the corporate said, as long as you adopt market-friendly policies, we are prepared to open up space, first of all for politically connected blacks. Yes, we recognise there is need for more black faces in the boardroom, and we also recognise that if you're going to have more black faces in the boardroom, then it's got to be backed by some form of advance of capital. In 1999, the Black Economic Commission was set up, basically after complaints during the mid-1990s from aspirant black business organisations saying, actually, you know, things aren't moving fast enough. We need a faster rate of transformation. That sounds familiar, doesn't it? We need a faster rate of transformation. It's all very well having people like Patrice Motsepe and Cyril Ramaphosa making lots of money, but what about the rest of us? We want to see more pressure on the corporations to provide greater opportunity. And so this led to the establishment of the BEE, Black Economic Commission under the chairmanship of Cyril Ramaphosa, and this led to a series of recommendations in 2002 and to the passage of the broad-based Black Economic Empowerment Act of 2003, which basically led to the inauguration of the Codes of Good Practice and the development of industry charters. And I've mentioned earlier in the lecture that in many ways I see these charters as based upon the codes of conduct which we saw in the 1970s, 80s. How many people have you, black people, have you got sitting in your boardroom? How many black managers have you got? How many are black male? How many are black female? What skills development processes are you doing? What are your involvement in the community, and so on and so forth. So, and these are all put together and deals done in the different sectors of industry. And of course, the different sectors allow supposedly for some variation across the different sectors of industry because they all have different problems. What are the problems with BE, of course? And why is it that many people say that BEE has not succeeded in terms of promoting an adequate, large... Can I come back in just a minute? Yes. I've nearly finished. Why is it that there is so limited progress in terms of the upper echelons? First of all, in terms of promoting black capital, of course, there was a lack of capital amongst blacks. If you're going to create a class of black capitalists, where's the capital going to come from when historically the black middle class has been robbed of the opportunity to make a lot of money, most of them? And of course what this meant was that the large corporates went along to the banks, borrowed money to enable blacks to buy shares, and of course it's all very well and the share market is going up, but when there's the Asian crisis of 1998, those who've bought shares suddenly find that what looked a good deal suddenly find that they're in debt again. So black advancement was made vulnerable, and that's a long story, and I'm not sufficiently up in the BE story to know how that is going, but still the black participation, black ownership or black ownership of shares on the on the JSE is still pretty low. I think it's still around, it's still hovering between 5 and 10%. I think I stand to be corrected there, but I don't think it's above 10%. And it has been higher at stages, but it's sunk. And I think given those sorts of difficulties, we see that's why BEE has, particularly in the last few years, become so thoroughly linked to the acquisition of government contracts. Basically, and this is very much at local level and at provincial level, the way in which black entrepreneurs and black companies see the way to profit and prosperity is by getting tenders from government. And then, of course, that's into the whole issue of your connections with the ANC again, and we get the issues of fronting and tenderpreneurship. So again, this notion of the party state and some sort of, if you're going to get on, then you need some form of political connection. Then I leave open the question whether BE is about elite formation rather than black and middle class formation. Nonetheless, I think it has been an important part of the story. So that is what I've got to say today. So can I open this up to queries, questions, debate, whatever? There was a question back there.
I'm sorry. So the BEE, I know that when it started, they implemented BEE, and then people got black workers to come to work at the firms, and then after they got the levels of BEE, because you get from 1 to 8, they just got the plaque and they fired the workers, and because it's a year contract, or each year they have to do this section again of looking at all the workers. So then they implemented the career aspect of the BEE, and so can it be like a sense of, because the BEE is also very controversial because they give funding to black entrepreneurs, and then they don't become independent because they use funding of other people's capital to profit. So
okay. Look, I think something like BE is always going to be controversial, but I think that at the same time you can see why the ANC felt compelled to introduce something like that, because look at the JSE. It is overwhelmingly owned by foreign companies and by white shareholders. Now that is, in a country such as our own, it is not a recipe for political stability. It probably doesn't make an awful lot of common sense economically either, because if you keep your share wealth within one sector of the community, then you're not going to promote a more broader-based economy. So clearly something had to be done, and I rather suspect that unless some sort of political pressure had been put upon the private sector companies to open up their boardrooms and to open up and to encourage black shareholding, that probably the pace would have been slower as well. So I'm very sympathetic to the notion of some sort of political pressure. The problem, of course, is, as you're suggesting, how you actually develop it, what mechanisms you introduce, and how you monitor it, and so on and so forth, and what is going on under the table. I mean, that's also something very, very difficult to actually find out, because by its nature, under the table deals are criminal. So I think BEE is a very mixed bag. We know there has been significant corruption linked to it, but on the other hand, as I put to you, without BEE was a political necessity in terms of putting pressure on companies, and also I think in terms of the ANC's own political needs. It's got to demonstrate to its own constituency that it is behind the notion of some sort of transformation. So I think that's the best I can do. Gentleman up the back.
This figure that's often bandied about black ownership of the stock exchange, surely that's very disingenuous. I mean, if one looks at stock exchanges, free and open stock exchanges anywhere in the world, they are by and large made up of huge amounts of foreign investment, and they're also made up primarily of investment funds control and own most of the shares. The amount of private sharing on any major stock exchange is very, very small. And if we look at the funds, the vast majority of those funds are in turn owned by provident funds and pension funds of large corporations, which by their very nature, by your own statistics, would show you that the black actual indirect shareholding in stock exchanges is way more than what is presently being bandied about.
I absolutely agree with you, because I think that if you look at the share ownership, yes, I mean, I think fairly recently, I mean, it goes up and down, of course. Fairly recently, I think 50% of the shares on the JSE are actually owned by foreign companies. That was figure certainly 2 or 3 years ago. It may be less or it may be more now. And you're absolutely right, institutional investors tend to be very significant too, and the amount of individual shareholding is usually fairly limited in stock exchanges. The problem is what we're looking at here is the political salience of the figures that are pushed about. I think what is significant, first of all, is that it would seem that there have not been significant expansion of black share ownership on the JSE since the 1990s. It seemed to rise quite rapidly in the early 1990s, and it was hit very severely by the Asian crisis, so there was that. Of course, do you count, when you're counting share ownership, are you talking about direct ownership or are you talking about indirect ownership? And if you include black pension owners into the statistics, then you may get up to about 15 or perhaps 20% of black ownership on the JSE. So again, you've got to meld that into the equation. But I'm just suggesting that it is very much a matter of political debate, and it's one in which is, as you are indicating, is highly contested. But I think what the key factor we're getting out of this is that direct black share ownership is still, I think, very significantly lower than white ownership.
Thanks. I have two related dichotomies I want to ask you about. The first is, you talk about elite transition, some people call it an elite compact. Would you agree that it was not a compact of the Constitution, because the Constitution provides for a lot of progressive things? It was a political decision that was taken around that time or later. And then that leads me to my second dichotomy, which is there are moments, and I think that's intrinsic to your course, where you have to choose between black middle class and black poor achieving their objectives. And I want to give you one example, and that is in education. If you choose to back the teachers' union, even though they're not teaching well, that's a political decision that backs a middle class versus backing the pupils getting a good education, even if it means sidelining a lot of the black middle class teachers. And that was a political decision to make. Let me
look at the first one first. I think you're absolutely right. When we're talking about a political deal, I mean, what went on at Codessa and all those things was, I think, fairly transparent. We knew that quite a lot. We know there was obviously those meetings between Cyril and Rolf Mayer and that sort of thing, but it was a fairly open, transparent process. But I think what we see in terms of the deals with the companies in the ANC was going on alongside, and it was not so transparent, but it was, I think, highly influential in turning the ANC around from its proclaimed pursuit of socialist policies and acceptance of a market-friendly policy and the introduction of GEAR in 1996 and so on.
But that's not in the Constitution.
That's not in the Constitution. No, it's quite separate. It's a separate sort of behind closed doors conversations. education thing, I'm going to be talking about education tomorrow, so I'd rather sort of leave that tomorrow. Just the other questions here.
So we were all talking about the stock exchange. What about the non-listed privately owned black companies? How much capital is invested in them? How do you get those figures?